The historic sins of communism and fascism are well documented. Often ignored, however, is the murder, violence, and antipathy to democracy done in the name of anti-communism. In his new book, Jakarta Method, journalist Vincent Bevins examines how Washington's anti-communist crusade undermined embryonic democracy in the global south and allowed colonialism to endure by another name. Vincent, welcome to Novara Media.
Thank you for having me.
You're coming to us from Sao Paulo in Brazil, I believe. Is that correct?
Yep. Wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be on a book tour, but I got stuck. When the pandemic hit, I was reporting on Bolsonaro in Brasilia, and I just stayed in my old hometown.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second. Before we carry on, can you just talk a little bit about your CV? Because I think it lends real authority to you writing about the subject matter that you do, particularly Indonesia and Brazil. How does that relate to your sort of professional life over the last decade?
Yeah, the decision to write this book emerged directly out of that professional life. So most of my career has been as a foreign correspondent for mainstream English language newspapers. The Financial Times sent me here to Sao Paulo in 2010. Then I ended up working as a LA Times correspondent here in Sao Paulo until 2016. In 2017, I moved to Southeast Asia to cover the whole region for the Washington Post, based in Jakarta. And it was there when I realized that this story of the mass murder in 1965 was really behind everything that I was reporting on. It was under the surface, no matter where I looked. And when I would talk about this event to people back here in the English-speaking world or in the Western Hemisphere, nobody knew about it. It was something that was really appreciated and misunderstood. So I decided to, and when I discovered that there were links between Indonesia and countries in South America where I know the languages and I know people, Chile and Brazil, I thought this could be an angle to come at it again and try to get this story told finally or again.
I mean, we'll go into the context. We're going to try and sort of build the interview up, talk about the historical context within which these movements, national liberation, economic nationalist movements kind of emerge in the 40s, 50s, and then what happens in the 1960s, essentially. But you've already touched upon Indonesia. I think it's really important because even for myself, I was familiar with Sukarno.
Right.
I was familiar with, General Suharto. I knew there was a sort of CIA endorsed coup. I knew that the Communist Party, the PKI, had been smashed in Indonesia, but I was not familiar with the numbers. Can you just briefly talk about how big the PKI was in the international context, how influential it was domestically, and the extent of the bloodshed when they were gotten rid of, essentially, by General Suharto in the mid-60s?
Yeah, so in the early 60s, the PKI was the largest communist party outside of the Soviet Union and China, which means it was probably the largest unarmed socialist party in history. 25 to 30% of Indonesians either were in the party or somehow affiliated with the party. Everybody knew that they would have won elections had there been more elections. The CIA, MI6, they all recognized this behind the scenes. And practically overnight, in just a matter of months, the US-backed Indonesian military, led by General Suharto, executed approximately 1 million innocent civilians for being in the PKI or somehow associated with it, and kept another million in concentration camps well into the 70s, purely for their political beliefs. And these are political beliefs that a lot of people now in the early 20th century would consider very obvious, if not inspiring. They were held in prison or killed basically for believing in something that a lot of people today would find worth defending.
So you situate the crusade against communism, quite rightly, obviously. I mean, we could go back further, talk about the whites in response to the Russian Revolution and so on, but I think it's a good place to start. Post-1945 and the creation of this new taxonomy: first, second, third world. First world is what we call the global north. Second world was, Russia and its kind of satellites and so on, the Soviet Union and its satellites. And then there was this category of the third world.
Right.
Now, if you do development studies today, people say, please don't say the third world, it's the developing world. But as you kind of illuminate, actually, people took a great deal of pride in defining themselves as part of a third world movement. Can you just quickly kind of describe where these categories came from and how people in poorer countries actually found that quite empowering?
Yeah, I think it's a really good, the reason I start in 1945 is this is the moment when the United States enters the world stage as the most powerful country in history by far. So in a way, the book is not only about the murder of the Communist Party in 1965 in Indonesia and its consequences around the world, but about the nature of U.S. hegemony which starts in 1945. And as you rightly point out, the third world as a term was initially a very optimistic, forward-thinking, proud concept. It was not just a category imposed from without, it was a self-conscious movement to unite the peoples of the formerly colonized world, come together, change the rules of the global economy, of the global political system, and take their position on the world stage that they thought would be rightfully theirs because, colonialism was over. So they believed, of course, we should be able to rise to the same position that the white countries that formerly colonized us are in. And I spent a lot of time talking to the people that lived through this moment in the 50s and 60s in Indonesia and Southeast Asia and Latin America. And it's hard to overemphasize how much they really believed that this would happen. It seemed obvious that the third world would be not the derogatory less than world, but the new act, the third and final act of human history, which would improve upon and fulfill the destiny of everything that had happened in the post-colonial world. Now, of course, the derogatory current term, the derogatory connotations come upon in the English language because of the racism that is employed by English speakers. But it was a self-conscious movement to transform the world in a truly post-colonial way, to really end the legacy of colonialism and all of its consequences.
And if we sort of try to understand who Sukarno was in Indonesia, can you talk a bit about his story, Indonesia's story, coming out of the Second World War, coming out of the end of what happens to be, in this case, the end of Dutch Empire?
Yeah, and so President Sukarno is the founding leader, or one of the founding leaders of the Third World Movement, and he is the founding father of Indonesia. He provides the sort of he gives voice to the ideology, to the feeling of nationhood that brings together the thousands and thousands of islands that used to be under Dutch colonial control. And this is the only thing that really brings these islands together, is their shared colonial history and their shared anti-colonial struggle, right? So Indonesianness from the very beginning was born out of a feeling of anti-imperialism. It was automatically socialist. Almost anybody that supported the anti-imperial, anti-colonial struggle in the 30s and 40s and 50s would considered it obvious that this would also mean socialism, to the point that Sukarno himself grew out of a milieu in the 20s in which the Muslim groups worked very closely with the Communist Party, and this was considered a huge success for the kind of Communist Party that collaborated actively and deeply with quote-unquote bourgeois nationalist forces. For this reason, the PKI had a very moderate and slow-moving heritage, like deep in its bones. It was always a party that worked across the ideological spectrum. And Sukarno is the George Washington, the founding father of this movement. He declares independence from the Dutch. He helps to lead the fight that eventually expels them after their attempts to reconquer the country from 1945 to 1949. And he becomes the first president. And the PKI becomes part of a multi-party democracy in a very young country. And they do better and better under Sukarno's rule. And Sukarno, as a left-wing president, tolerates and supports the existence of the Communist Party, but is never himself a communist. He insists on a new path for the Third World, which will neither be fully in alignment with the West or with the Soviet Union. This eventually becomes the non-aligned movement, which Sukarno helps to found in 1961 in Yugoslavia. But at its very basis, Sukarnoism and Indonesianism was an anti-imperial, left-leaning project that brought together 5 or 6 religions, hundreds of ethnicities, hundreds of languages under the rule of President Sukarno.
So you sort of got this post-imperial moment going from, let's say, 45 to 60. We could go further. Continues for a lot longer. Obviously, it's Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, South Africa, and so on. But 1960 probably sort of as the apogee with what was called Congo. But who else would we be thinking of in this kind of orbit of national leaders? So you've said one is Sukarno. Where else and what names would you say were in and around that kind of, in his orbit, intellectually, socially, politically? Because there's many of them.
Yeah, Nehru in India. So Nehru was a hugely important figure behind the 1955 Bandung conference held in Indonesia, the first Afro-Asian conference. Nasser comes on the scene after these two, but Nasser in Egypt is a very important part of this movement. China participates in a way in the 1955 Bandung Conference, but it's not clear to what extent their communism means that they should take the side of the third world or the second world. And in Bandung, they kind of throw in their lot with the third world movement. As I said, in 1961, the non-aligned movement is founded in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. So Tito is an important member of this movement. And increasingly, as the 50s and 60s goes on, a lot of Latin American leaders who are not even really left-leaning at all want to throw their lot in with this new global south-to-south cooperation for economic reasons, for geopolitical reasons. So Brazil was a observer of the 1955 Bandung Conference, but then later in the early 60s, they ended up coming closer in alignment with the non-aligned countries.
So you said Bandung. For people who aren't familiar with that, what is Bandung?
Bandung is a city in Java, so the most populous island in the world, but also the most populous island in Indonesia, of course. And in 1955, Sukarno and Nehru oversaw the Afro-Asian People's Conference, which brings together almost half of the world's peoples. And this is, in Sukarno's words, the first ever meeting of the so-called colored peoples of mankind. And you can watch his opening speech at that conference, and it's very striking. The vision that he puts forward in Bandung in 1955 is something that I think would really resonate with a lot of people in 2020, because, especially people very aware of the deeply problematic racial history at the heart of the United States and Western Europe as well. And this is the founding of the Third World movement. This, the term for Third World was coined in 1951 in France, but 1955 really gave the Third World movement a concrete place in history, and the whole world noticed. In the book, I talk about the report from the conference written by Richard Wright, an African-American author from the United States that went to cover it, and he was just blown away by the possibilities and what could happen in the third world, and how little he knew about the exploitation of the world's colonized peoples. And this was one of two things in the middle of the 50s that convinced the United States that Sukarno's left-leaning anti-colonial experiment could no longer be tolerated. In the beginning of his country, there was, let's say, they thought it was all right. They thought he could be put up with. By the middle of the 1950s, they changed their mind. For one of the reasons was the Bandung Conference, and we can see that they spoke about this conference in very derogatory and racist ways in the United States. And number two was that the Indonesian Communist Party, who, as I said, was committed to nonviolent electoral struggle, were doing better and better in elections. And we know now from declassified files that the officials in the United States government recognized that the reason they were winning elections was because they were doing the best outreach to the people. They weren't tricking people. They weren't forcing people. They were the most organized and least corrupt party. And this gradual increase in their share of the vote caused the CIA to go into their new war chest that had been created in the first years of its establishment.
So we've got to 1955 there, but if we sort of roll back a year or two, we begin to see the genesis of what is the sort of crux of tonight's show. We're talking about anti-communism. People are thinking, oh, this is a bit of a detour. But what we see in 1953 in Iran, 1954 in Guatemala, is quite a notable shift in US foreign policy under Dwight Eisenhower. Right. Can you talk about what happens? How does the United States start to treat differently the kinds of regime you've just talked about, and how does that end up in quite murderous conclusions? So let's start with Iran and then talk about Guatemala, and particularly in relation to Guatemala, how that politicized a certain Che Guevara. So starting with Iran, can you explain what happened there and its relationship to anti-communism and democratic kind of overthrow by United States-backed forces?
Yeah, I'll move back even a little bit before that. The CIA was founded in the late 1940s, and this was the attempt by the new most powerful country on earth to replicate MI6 and the historic imperial secret spy agencies that the United States had not had until this point. And the guys that they got for this job tended to be cosmopolitan liberals that went to Yale or boarding schools in the northeast of the United States that were explicitly modeled on Eton. And these were guys that thought they were really smart, were given a lot of money and resources, and told to fight communism. And at the beginning, they tried to actually take on Eastern Europe, the actual Stalin-aligned or Stalin-dominated nations of the Soviet Union, and where the Red Army had set up camp after World War II. They failed repeatedly in Eastern Europe. They could not break in. They kept sending volunteers and parachuters to their deaths. And it was at that point they decided to turn to the third world because they had to fight communism somewhere. Two, Dwight Eisenhower is elected. In Dwight Eisenhower, there's a real shift that coincides with this reorientation of the CIA, whereas Truman had thought, okay, I need to confront the Soviet Union. These neutral countries out in the third world, or Africa and Asia, can be tolerated. In Iran, it was actually the British that came to the Americans and said, you need to help us topple this new regime, which is getting in, messing with our oil interests and our historic imperial role in Iran. And at first the CIA was like, maybe. The British really pressed the CIA on this and said, oh, well, there's also communism. They used anti-communism, which they knew was rampant in the entirety of the US government after McCarthyism, because due to McCarthyism, anybody that was not a rabid anti-communist was removed from the US government, and this included a lot of the smartest people that could have told them how to approach Asia, because a lot of the Asia specialists were purged. So in 1953, because of anti-communism, because of pressure from the British, because of oil interests, the CIA succeeds in overthrowing the government of Iran. And this is seen as a huge success for the CIA, for Eisenhower, for the Cold War, for the United States. And they think, oh, well, this new agency we've created, this is great. We can do what we failed to do in Korea without having to lose any American lives. And immediately they find another place to put this into practice, which is Guatemala in 1954. And Guatemala in 54 really serves as the emblematic case upon which they base a lot of their future interventions in the Cold War. And in Guatemala, you had Jacobo Arbenz, who was at best a liberal reformer, at most wanted to sort of pull Guatemala out of feudalism into capitalism.
His big thing was land reform, right?
His big thing was land reform. And the problem with land reform was that if he were to carry out land reform, United Fruit Company, which owned loads of land but had been lying about how much it was worth, would not have gotten as much as they thought that they should have gotten. But also there was a Communist Party that was active in Guatemala that had been very influential in organizing resistance to dictatorships in that country for a long time. So again, these two complementary forces come into play. On the one hand, you have United Fruit Company in the United States putting a lot of pressure on the US government, flying journalists out to Guatemala and showing them exactly what they want them to see so that they'll come up with reports in major outlets in the United States saying that, Guatemala is going to follow communism. And on the other hand, you have this sort of fanatical attempt and fanatical desire to fight communism wherever it was. Now, we now know from declassified files that what the State Department was really saying behind the scenes was that they knew that there was no threat of a communist beachhead in Central America. They knew that Guatemala was not a threat to the United States. But what they were very explicitly worried about was the possibility that a successful series of reforms that took place outside of the influence of the United States would inspire other countries in the region to do the same thing. So they even use the language of David in Goliath. So if David succeeds at standing up to Goliath, us, everybody else down there is going to want to do that too. So to a very large extent, the problem was not that they were going to fall into a Stalinist authoritarian, into the Stalinist camp, but that they would be able to establish a socialist project that challenged growing US hegemony in a way that would be inspiring in its very democratic nature. And they succeeded in overthrowing Arbenz in 1954. We have evidence that this was the first time that they handed lists to the new government of communists to be executed, which was carried out. And as you said, Che Guevara was in Guatemala City in 1954. He was part of a group of people that said, no, we should not give in to the US-backed coup, because in Central America at this point in time, it was not unfamiliar that if the United States was saying that you had to go, you knew that it was going to happen sooner or later. Che Guevara, along with the Communist Party, would say, no, we have to fight this. We cannot put up with whatever there is going to come afterwards. That is not the direction that Arbenz took. Arbenz thought that a deal could be made. He passed over control of the country to the leader of his armed forces. He was thrown out by the Americans. The Americans told him, no, that's not going to be satisfactory to us. And there was a bloodbath of the people that Che Guevara had been working with. And Che Guevara comes to the conclusion at this time that you cannot set up democratic socialism in the backyard of the United States. They're going to come for you. So if you're going to have any kind of a social revolution, you're going to have to create a tightly organized and deeply self-defensive project. And this is what he does when he eventually takes power in Cuba in 1959.
I mean, that's the kind of the resounding theme that you get throughout the book. I mean, my colleague at Novara Media, Michael Walker, has talked about it repeatedly. And, you know, when people sort of castigate the projects of Venezuela, Cuba, etc., over the course of the 20th century, the context there is that social democracy of the kind that we take for granted in Europe was simply impermissible in the eyes of the United States. It simply was not allowed. And that's the lesson that Che Guevara takes from that. Now, late 1950s, the CIA tries something similar in Indonesia. Before we talk about Sukarno going, the Communist Party being massacred, the CIA tries something quite similar in 57, 58, doesn't it? Can you talk? Now, they've had success in Guatemala, they've had success in Iran. They're going, wow, this is so easy. Next is Indonesia. What happens?
It doesn't work. So you won't be surprised to hear that the Indonesian left and the Indonesian general was paying very close attention to what happened in Iran and Guatemala. And I compared the newspapers written in Indonesian at the time compared with the New York Times, and the Indonesians were paying a lot closer attention to these coups than Americans were. And you can understand why. They weren't sure if this new colonial independence thing was real. They didn't know if they were going to be reconquered. They were very worried about this new white country that was taking over for the old white countries that had explicitly dominated for hundreds of years. Now, in 1958, the CIA organizes an actual bombing campaign of Indonesian islands. And this invasion is explicitly based on the success of Guatemala in 1954. They find local partners who did have their own complaints about Sukarno's regime at the time, but they backed what are called regional rebellions on islands outside of Java, which is the core center of population in Indonesia. And there's these bizarre moments where the Indonesians know that this must be a US-backed invasion because they're using planes and weapons that Indonesians don't have. But yet the post-colonial dynamic the imbalance is so great that they're not even able to really confront the United States and accuse them this directly. They're kind of like, hey, do you have an explanation for why bombs that only you make are falling upon our civilians? And of course, the ambassador doesn't even know what's happening because the CIA is organizing this invasion behind his back. But eventually what happens in 1958 is an American boy or a military soldier named Alan Pope crash lands on the island of Ambon with his identifying papers still on him, and everybody that has been accusing the United States of trying to destroy Indonesia is proved correct. And the ambassador at the time, in his memoirs, he says, well, at this point, Sukarno and the Indonesian government in general moved to the left. They moved closer to the Soviet Union, and I understand why. They had been trying since the inception of the country to maintain good relations with the United States, and they just caught us trying to blow up the country. So after that, the CIA and the United States government in general shift tactics. Instead of directly making war on the Indonesian army, they decide to make peace with the Indonesian army, bring them to the United States for training, and form very deep ties with the Indonesian military in ways that are reminiscent of the ways that Latin American militaries had trained with the United States for a very long time, with the understanding that sometimes the job of the military was to do more than just be the military. Sometimes the job of the military was to run the economy, run the whole country.
You talked briefly there about the ambassador didn't know what the CIA was doing. And this, again, is a theme that comes through again and again. The CIA is acting almost semi-autonomously of the American state. Of course, the American state's a polyarchy of multiple institutions, but there are really important players in American politics who aren't entirely sure what the CIA are doing at any particular moment. Is that a bug or is that a feature?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. And there's this ongoing debate about the CIA, and sort of on one side, there's the sort of almost conspiratorial view that they're controlling everything, that everything that ever happens, they have their hand somehow behind it, which I think is wrong, because you can look at the many times that they fail over and over again. And on the other hand, people say that they're not effective because they fail so often. But I think what's important about understanding the CIA is that when you are the secret, clandestine organization for the most powerful country on earth, you don't get in trouble when you screw up. There's no consequences for anything that you ever do. So you can get caught, you can try again, you can get caught again, you try again. And as long as you're not hurting anybody back in the United States, which is never the case, you can just keep hammering and hammering away. And the fact that they operated outside of the purview of what the State Department knew about meant that they often led the charge. So a lot of times the State Department found themselves in the position of having to explain what the CIA had already done, or adapting to a situation that the CIA had created. Often not exactly what they wanted to create, often not what the State Department would have created, but it gives them enormous power. And as I said, like in Guatemala, they got caught. It was their third attempt to do a coup in Guatemala. The first 2 times they got caught. But when it's the United States, who are you going to tell? I mean, there's no referee. No one sits above the hegemon, right? So Arbenz tried to denounce the coup plot that he found, and the CIA didn't even care. They just did it again.
I just want to quickly say we are 25 minutes into this. You're watching Novara Media. My name's Aaron Bastani. I've got the great pleasure of being joined by Vincent Bevins, journalist, author of Jakarta Method. This is not Tiki Sa. This show is about making a deep dive, just like Thomas Colston into the harbour at Bristol, into the big ideas behind events. Last week we talked to Alex Vitale about defunding the police. This week we're talking about the history of the CIA, particularly in relationship to the global south, fighting anti-communism and the victims of anti-communism. We'll be talking about that more over the next half an hour. If you like what you're watching, hit the subscribe button. We've got, like I say, about 1,000 people watching. About 350 people have liked the show. Cost you nothing. Also, smash the like button. So, Vincent, we've talked about the CIA playing games, 57, 58. They then changed tack to a more kind of South American approach, where they get the officer class of the Indonesian military to kind of see themselves as, effectively a sort of appendage of the American empire. What happens in the mid-1960s when finally Sukarno goes? It seems like a bit of a slow motion process. Mm-hmm. What triggers this? Because what follows after he goes, particularly with relation to the PKI, you can talk about the scale of the deaths. To make such an appalling thing happen, what was the catalyst?
2 things happened. So from 1958 to 1963, as I said, there's this kind of informal partnership between Washington and the armed forces, and this ambassador who understood Indonesia better than a lot of people in Washington was pushing for an alliance with Sukarno. So there was a kind of tentative friendship. 2 things happen that ends this partnership. 1, John F. Kennedy is killed, and 2, Great Britain creates the country of Malaysia in a way which is offensive to Sukarno. So for part 1, John F. Kennedy has invested a lot of political and economic capital in maintaining this relationship with Indonesia. Lyndon Johnson comes in. He understands the third world much less. He has less economic and political capital to spend. There's people in Congress accusing him of being soft on communism. He just decides to abandon this partnership. 2, Malaysia is created in such a way, and I think a lot of people will be familiar with this pattern in Africa and the Middle East. Malaysia is created in such a way so as to unite disparate ethnicities and weaken opponents, or the perceived opponents, of the United Kingdom. And Sukarno accuses the United Kingdom of intentionally drawing lines across the map that will weaken the left in Southeast Asia. And he's right. I mean, everybody, behind the scenes in the West knows this is the point of adding these 2 parts of Borneo that have no cultural or historical relationship to mainland Malaysia. He's not wrong that this is what's happening, but he does pick a fight with somebody that he is not powerful enough to take on. So when he officially opposes the creation of Malaysia in something that's called confrontasi, or just confrontation, this is seen in the West, Washington and London, as a step too far. The ambassador, which has been tasked for 5 years with maintaining friendship between the West and Indonesia, is pulled out, and they bring in a regime change ambassador. And this is a pattern that was very familiar in the Cold War. They would bring in a guy that everybody knew was like a coup specialist. It was the case in Guatemala in 54. It was the case in Indonesia before 1965. They brought in somebody who had carried out a coup in South Korea. And we don't know exactly what CIA and MI6 do behind the scenes in 1964 and 1965 because these files are still declassified. But we know that they are agitating covertly to create a clash between the unarmed popular Communist Party and the very well-armed right-wing Indonesian military. Understanding very well, of course, that when an armed and an unarmed group clash, the armed group wins. And probably one part of this covert agitation included spreading rumors that would try to provoke people into acting immaturely. There was all kinds of white and black propaganda that was very likely carried out, but like I said, we don't have the receipts. But what we know is that in 1965, the clash that they're agitating for happens. There is a small uprising led by military officers to, according to them, kidnap generals that are planning a right-wing coup. For reasons we don't understand, these generals end up dead. For reasons we don't understand, a general named Suharto is not among those that was kidnapped. For reasons we don't understand, Suharto was very easily able to take control of the country, establish communications hegemony in the country, which means he shuts down every media outlet that he does not control, and he ignores the existence of President Sukarno. He just takes over as the leader of the country, and immediately starts to spread a story, an intentional lie, and it seems a very well-crafted one, perhaps so well-crafted that it must have been created in advance and with help from others, that this was not an officer's revolt. This was not a military attempt to kidnap 6 or 7 generals. This was actually a devious communist plot to take over the country. And these 6 generals had actually been murdered and tortured by the Indonesian women's movement, the feminist wing of the Indonesian left. The military spreads this horrible story that these women took the generals to their communist evil lair, literally castrated them in a sort of Marxist tantric sexual murder orgy, right? And this story is spread with the help of the United States and the BBC and Radio Australia, so that the entire thing could be blamed on the left, which the United States and the Indonesian military have been trying to crush for a decade. And it's extremely effective. This becomes the official truth of what happened for decades. You know, it only through bits and pieces over the last 56 years as we figured out the extent to which that was an intentional lie, to the extent to which everybody involved knew it was a lie. And of course, this is the tale that was used to justify the subsequent and immediate mass arrest and then mass murder of the Indonesian left.
And in terms of deaths, how many are we looking at in Indonesia over a period of several years?
It was not several years. It was maybe 6 months. It was very relatively quick and easy. The estimates are approximately 1 million is the language I use. So sometimes estimates range between 500,000 and 1 million killed. One Indonesian officer claimed it was 3 million. He may have been bragging and exaggerating, but really we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because this has been shoved into the background of history. Nobody ever did a truth commission. No one ever went around Indonesia and asked everybody how many relatives they lost, because the people that lost relatives to this day are considered, if not tainted, at least, no, they're considered tainted. Anybody that even admits to having been involved in the Indonesian left in the early 60s, and this is a third of the country, or to have family members or friends that were victimized by this horrific violence are considered the guilty ones.
You talk about sort of beaches. I think it's in Bali. Maybe it was Java.
That's Bali.
It's Bali. And it's kind of just replete with Australian tourists and, I think you say Russian Instagram models and stuff. And this was the very place where, thousands of people were taken to be summarily executed.
Yep. So Bali was the most violent. I mean, we don't know exactly, but our best guess is that Bali was the most violent of location in this mass murder. Maybe 5% of the country was killed, maybe more. And the very beach that is now the site of expensive tourist resorts in Seminyak, in Southwest Bali was a killing field. And it was also where that they would take bodies to be disposed of in the middle of the night, sort of just thrown into the water. And I spoke with, the local village leader that lives in this region. He sort of lives in a tiny little street behind mega hotels for white people. And over the last few decades, every once in a while, they find bones underneath these tourist resorts, and he gives them a proper Hindu funeral and makes sure that they, are given the respect that he believes they deserve. But they're still under the sand of and it was not a coincidence that the tourist hotels went up in the years right after this mass killing. The mass killing made the tourism industry possible in Bali, because the question of land reform and who controlled the island of Bali was at the heart of what powered the violence. And after the right-wing military took over, it was very clear what kind of economic model would be put in place. It would be the free market, liberal kind of economy, which is poorest to international capital.
The language which you kind of cite in kind of the primary documents, or when you're talking to people, I mean, it's a fantastic. We were talking about the book before we came on air. You said it took 3 years to write, with the sort of data collection of interviews and the literature review, and getting the documentary evidence from the period and so on. But there was real congruence in how left, not even communists, and this is something we can talk about in the last sort of 25 minutes of the show, trade unionists, feminists, social democrats, people that just believed in human rights, all of these people were decimated in the name of anti-communism because they were just adjacent to what was perceived as a pro Moscow political organization or set of individuals.
Mm-hmm.
But the language that's deployed for these people, often who aren't even particularly radical, who are just looking for the kind of land rights you would see in Western Europe, for instance, or North America,
or even South Korea or Japan, or the areas where the U.S. actually wanted the country to develop.
Yeah, the language that's being deployed, to me, was startlingly similar to the war on terror. And after 9/11, there was this you got this canon of literature which says, there's this new legal figure of the terrorist, they have no rights and so on. But it seems to me that's not quite necessarily true. It does seem to me that the communist is the person who is stripped of their humanity, therefore doesn't deserve the human rights which you would think everybody else deserves. Is that a fair assessment? Were communists during this period of anti-communist terror, were they sort of perceived as, say, the 9/11 bombers were treated, in the immediate period after September 2001?
Yeah, I think in order to carry out this kind of atrocity, you have to dehumanize. You have to treat them as not really people, not really worthy of the rights that everybody else is afforded. And the entire U.S. security state that comes into existence after 9/11 is premised on the idea that anybody that is a terrorist or associated with terrorism, or in any way the kind of Muslim that could be called a terrorist, is not deserving of the same rights as anybody else on the planet. And there was a deep dehumanization that started in the 50s in the United States, and took different forms around the world throughout the Cold War to treat communists as the same thing. Is that, and they're in some of the Western accounts of the decimation of the Indonesian Communist Party in 1965, this exact kind of language is used. It's like, oh, well, it doesn't matter because they were communists, right? So yeah, they weren't really hundreds of thousands of people killed. It was hundreds of thousands of communists. And as you say, in Indonesia, there's a lot of things that were very chilling about reporting this book, and I try very hard to make the book not nearly as difficult to read as it was for me to report. But one of the things that was very difficult is that the precise reason that it was so easy to kill approximately 1 million people in Indonesia is because they didn't think that they were doing anything wrong at all. They went into police stations to give interviews. They said, oh yeah, I'll come down and talk to the military. I'm in a union. I really want to be a teacher. And I joined, a Marxist study group when I was a kid because I loved, political theory or whatever. Or, my family is a peasant in the peasant organization because the BTI, the wing, the associated group of the Communist Party, has always been very helpful here in pushing for slightly more rights for us. If they had thought of themselves as rebels, it wouldn't have worked, right? If they were part of an underground guerrilla organization that were taught not to trust the U.S.-backed military, they wouldn't have gone in. and then never come out, right? It was precisely their belief in the validity of the rules and their innocence that allowed them to be slaughtered.
And kind of as a kind of addendum to that, this applies really more, from what I can tell from the book anyway, in Central and South America. But what is the relationship between this dehumanization of communists and indigenous peoples? Because, of course, indigenous peoples in places like Brazil and Guatemala are right at the bottom of the ladder. Naturally, they would tend towards a leftist progressive politics. How did this dovetail the kind of genocide against indigenous peoples and also a political hatred of the left?
I think that, as you point out rightly, anti-communism starts, in 1917. There's the United States backs white forces. It's not only something that starts in 1945 and is led by the United States, but I think that the anti-communist crusade that I discussed, the anti-communist crusade that really starts in 1945 and is led by the United States government, has to be situated in the long history of settler colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, I speak English, but I'm from America. I don't speak an American language because they got rid of all of those people, right? Like all of the Western, and I'm in Brazil, and like if you, in the book, I talked to a lot of Indonesians that moved from Indonesia to Brazil, and they said, oh, I see. I have to learn a European language because the Europeans killed all the locals, And we forget that because the United States and settler colonial culture is so almost natural now to global culture, but it's not natural, right? So it's a very strange history that the US has, and it's a history that is shared with Guatemala, with Brazil, with Chile, with Argentina. Every country in the hemisphere exists the way that it does because of the decimation and genocide of native peoples. And so the anti-communism that grows up in the 20th century in the United States and Brazil, and Brazilian anti-communism in many ways is not an import from the United States. They have their own very powerful fear of the brown and the indigenous and black peoples coming up against them. And anti-communism is a very powerful force in South America, even before the Cold War. All of this has to be situated in the history of settler colonialism. And this, this boomerangs, as you rightly point out, the worst anti-communist massacres in the Western Hemisphere, the ones that come close to hitting the numbers of Indonesia, happen against the indigenous peoples of Central America. And I spent a lot of time in Maya communities that were decimated by death squads in the 1980s with the support of the United States. And there was quite literally an automatic association between certain ethnic groups in Central America and communism. So the Ixil Maya were basically categorized as inherently genetically, racially predisposed to communism, and thus slotted for extermination. This is why in Guatemala they use the word genocide to describe the anti-communist mass murders, because these two things were seen as the same thing. Those types of people, those indigenous people, by their very nature, almost racially, are predisposed to disliking the private property and predisposed to valuing communal rights. I mean, never mind the fact that private property, as it has been imposed on them, has been a murderous regime. The settler colonial mindset, which gave rise to American-led anti-communism, boomeranged back to more decimation of indigenous peoples.
And in Central and South America, what numbers are we looking at? So you said, circa 1 million in Indonesia, but in Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, ballpark, are we still talking between them? We're talking hundreds of thousands?
Yeah, hundreds of thousands. So the way that it works chronologically is that in the early 70s, in Chile and Brazil, you have the deployment of the word Jakarta to signify the mass murder of leftists. They threatened leftists in Santiago with the slogan in graffiti and in postcards, Jakarta is coming, meaning we're going to kill you when we take over with the help of the CIA. This is exactly what happens. Jakarta does come to the Southern Cone. And then Brazil and Chile get together with all the other US-backed right-wing dictatorships in South America to form Operation Condor, which is an international mass murder network. And during the reign of terror of all these regimes, the death toll is in the tens of thousands. Argentina is the most murderous, but the all the regimes of South America in the 60s and 70s and 80s kill in the tens of thousands, maybe 70,000 to 90,000, something like this. In Central America, it's hundreds of thousands. So in Guatemala alone, it's probably 250,000 people. El Salvador, another 70,000 people. And again, this is not anybody that died because of an anti-communist regime. This is not war. This is not famine caused by bad governance. This is the intentional mass murder of innocent people.
Yeah, and I think, I think many of our viewers will be familiar with the extent of US interference in the Southern Hemisphere, sort of from the Monroe Doctrine on, from the 19th century. But it's ubiquitous, isn't it? It's every single country in South and Central America after 1945 basically has some level of interference. You've talked about Operation Condor there. So we've talked about the kind of Bandung moment, the Third World moment from 1945 through the end of European empires, all the way through to the mid-1960s. Operation Condor, I guess, is kind of like its converse, right? It's kind of mirror image of authoritarian, a sort of international of right-wing, anti-communist authoritarianism. Can you talk a little bit about Operation Condor, who was involved, who was funding it, and then also about the Anti-Communist League, because that seems like an even more hardcore organization with more far-right ideals.
Yeah, so to a large extent, Condor means that the Third World has shifted from its Bandung moment to its Jakarta moment, and Jakarta, in this case, signifying state terror and murder. So after Allende is successfully removed in 1973, with the help of the United States, with the help of Brazil, the countries of South America that are overseeing authoritarian capitalist regimes and trying to kill anybody that gets in their way start to realize, oh, well, some people are escaping across the border. So how do we solve that? So they get together in 1975, and Chile is the spearhead of this meeting. But several countries, the majority of South America at the time, get together to found Operation Condor, which is a solution to this problem of how do we kill people that escaped the country? How do we hunt down people around the world? And they really take a global scope, right? They kill somebody in Washington, D.C. They killed Orlando Letelier, not very far from the White House, who was a former member of Allende's administration. And they hunted down guerrillas and communists or dissidents, or even former member. Pinochet killed his former boss because he was a more moderate military commander that was going to write his memoirs about what really happened in Chile. So this wasn't sort of, and this is something I think I always want to stress, is this is not sort of like wanton vengeance. This was carefully planned, constructive violence. This was not violence that was incidental to the order that they created. It was constitutive of the order that they created, in the order that we now live in today. Now, you mentioned the World Anti-Communist League. This is one of many, 3 or 4 anti-communist international groups that were founded in the Cold War, and the WACL ends up being the one that brings a lot of different groups together. But you have a lot of these organizations. The first is the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which is founded by Eastern European Nazi sympathizers after the end of World War II. And then you have an organization in Mexico, which collaborates very up and down the hemisphere, and also with Asian countries. And then in 1967, you get the creation of the World Anti-Communist League, spearheaded by countries like South Korea and Taiwan. But then, of course, with the active participation of certain parts of the U.S. government. And what is really, I think, underappreciated is that anti-communism really was a global movement. And these sort of former Nazi sympathizers and death squad leaders and dictators and fanatical ideologues and the Moonies. I don't know if you know what the Moonies is. This was big in California when I grew up. This sort of quasi-cultish group that came out of Korea. They all were active, and they traded tips, right? They learned from each other. They were in constant contact. They said, oh, well, if this works, you could try it here. And that was really successful there, so maybe try it here. And if you look at the methods that are employed across different regime change operations, the coincidences are really striking. And I don't speculate at all in the book because there's so much of what we know for sure is so shocking that I don't think I need to go down those rabbit holes. But there's a lot of times when you see what happened in Chile in 1970 is really similar to what they did in Indonesia in 1965, or the story that the Indonesians told of of generals being stabbed in the night by devious communists is really similar to what Brazil had developed in the 1930s. So I think it's really important to understand the 20th century and the sort of the way that U.S. hegemony takes shape. We have to understand the extent to which anti-communism was an internationally cooperative force.
And I think what the book does really phenomenally well, because it doesn't end in 1990, but that's kind of how it feels a little bit. Obviously, many of these sort of debates carry on, and some of these regimes that are still in place and so on. You talk, for instance, about ASEAN. I had no idea. ASEAN, which is a kind of this bloc in Southeast Asia, comes out of effectively an opposition to an antipathy to communism. But what it does, I think, really effectively is says that the process we understand as globalization is effectively Americanization. It's a form of, international American empire, but it was never inevitable. And actually, these domestic regional conflicts, whether it was in South America, Central America, Africa, East Asia, South Asia, it was always politically contested. And I think you do that really well, because you're not just talking about others, big event with Sukarno or with Lumumba or whoever. You're talking about people at the granular level. This librarian who was a member of the Communist Party, her husband never came back from work one day, and he was sort of disappeared. I think you do that fantastically well. But is it fair to say that the world we inhabit today, that world of there is no alternative, that world of the end of history and so on, did that depend upon the success of anti-communist movements? Because we're told that communism fell. When I say communism, I'm not talking about the Soviet Union. I'm talking about a counter-modernity to the one that we have, a different kind of way of ordering society, which is what the Bandung Conference was about.
Right.
Do you think that the full closure of that depended upon the success of Pinochet, Suharto, and so on? Because this stuff's 55 years ago, but it still feels incredibly relevant.
I think that the success of the anti-communist violence that took place, and I counted at least 20 countries that carry out the intentional mass murder of leftist civilians. I think that the success of this violence is a fundamental part of what led to the world we inhabit today. It's not the only thing, but is a fundamental part that cannot be discarded. It is such a fundamental part that it is really built into the system that we have. And as you said, I told the story through all the people that lived through it, and they were able to tell me what it was like. And some of the most moving moments that I had with them, and also the sort of the saddest, was when they would talk about the 40s and 50s, and they would talk to me about what they thought the world was going to be like now then. And when they would speak about what they expected the world to be in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 21st century, this like you could see behind their eyes a whole universe of possibilities opened up, these things that they thought were really going to happen. And the question I ask at the end of the book is, was it really inevitable that this was insane? Were they really stupid and naive to think that the peoples of the colonized world could take an equal place alongside the white nations of the world? Could Bali be a place now where when white people walk around, they are just as valuable as the locals, rather than able to buy and sell people as they do quite horribly? Were they so insane to think that their time was coming? Were they so insane to think that capitalism was going to be replaced with, at least, if not a softer form, something different? And I don't know if I have the answer, but I know if you ask them, they look you right in the eye and they say, yeah, the reason we lost is because you killed my husband and you killed my friends and you won. And I wish you didn't, but you did. And that's and that's why you, Vincent, that's why you, when you sit here in front of me now, are much, much richer than I am. And my family could never have the life that you have. And there's nothing I like about that answer, but I don't think we're being responsible if we ignore that perspective.
There's a couple of lines. I mean, you've just sort of gestured towards it, but there's a couple of lines in the book where you just quite explicitly say, "Well, why do you think this happened? Why did you lose?" And it's just said, "Well, they killed us." Yeah. It wasn't some historic, Gramscian historic bloc or the battle of ideas. They just killed a hell of a lot of people, and they killed the people that could have potentially created a different kind of society. I guess we've got 5 minutes left. I'll take a few questions in a second. If you can put them in the comments with the rocket emoji, that would be great. You're watching Novara Media. I'm talking to Vincent Bevins. Fantastic, fantastic book. If you've just joined us, go to the beginning, watch it from the start. I think you'll learn a lot. I learned a lot reading the book. Again, going back to why I think the book and the stories you tell from the 50s, the 60s, why I think it's so relevant is because now if you look at the global south, Bolsonaro, Modi, Duterte, these kind of authoritarian strongmen, quote unquote nationalists, who actually aren't really trying to mess with the global economic status quo. You know, they very much want to play by the rules of foreign direct investment and free trade, sort of market capitalism. I guess it's my last question to you. Do you think it's possible that there could be a reassertion of more progressive nationalisms in these places, or do you just think that was a mid-20th century thing that's just been smashed and it's not coming back?
No, I think you could certainly imagine collaboration among a large number of countries for a specific outcome. And that's what kind of fell apart. I mean, that is one of the main things that fell apart at the end of the Bandung moment, is that this concerted, this plan to use international organizations like the UN to change the rules of the global economy fell by the wayside, because all the left-wing leaders of the Third World Movement were gone by the end of the 1960s. And then, you said the era of there is no alternative. We did have a moment of really unipolar power that from 1990 to 2016, 17 or so, where the United States had established such clear and convincing hegemony that perhaps at that point it was hard to even conceive of something different. But I think that the future lasts a long time. The story is unwritten, and you could very easily imagine the reemergence of an alliance among the countries that sort of want to put pressure on the global system in the same way that a union of workers might put pressure on the employer to demand better rules to govern the global economy.
There's one question here from Tony Cisse. Are there lessons for Africa and the movements against neo-colonialism in this? I guess Che Guevara took a lesson, which is, what they proceeded to do in Cuba. As you've said, a sort of highly defensive orientation. Is that the only lesson that you could take? Is the lesson here that you can't trust the gringos, you have to be heavily armed, you have to defend the revolution and so on? Or is there another one? Because again, one of the sort of background stories of this book is that actually it feels like the democratic road to socialism in the global south, particularly if you have resources, is simply not permitted by American empire.
It seemed that it was not allowed. If it was allowed at all from 1945 to 2000, there was a lot of roadblocks. But again, then there's no reason to believe that has to be the case forever. I certainly did not write the book hoping to make the case that you had to arm. I don't exactly know what the lessons are, because it is sort of just a straight history. I don't try to arrive at a certain point. I just sort of want to tell what happens to these people, and then I let them tell me and the reader at the end what they think happened. And to be very honest, I don't know what the implications are. I'm still hoping. I'm still thinking them through myself. I hope other people read the book too and can think about what it means too. But I would not like to affirm that we must always live in a world where the hegemon does not allow for any opposition. I don't think that's historically tenable anyways. It never works out that way. And hopefully just having a very deep understanding of how we got here will make us more able to understand what steps can be taken next.
We have a great question here from Gary Barnes. We've got a super chat from Jane Hayward, £10. Thank you, Jane. Great discussion. Thanks. Thank you very much. This is from Gary Barnes. And this is a great question. Have the CIA stopped acting in the same way as it did? And I suppose that would be born of 2 points. The fact that there are greater constraints, the America's not as powerful as it once was, and perhaps they have to because the world's a different place. Have they stopped acting in that way? And if so, when? Or have they just changed a bit?
So in mainstream, like in the United States mainstream discourse, there is sort of an unspoken assumption that, oh, yeah, well, like they don't do that kind of, they don't do bad stuff anymore. And in response to that sort of naive assertion, I always ask, like, well, at what point did they change what the entire purpose of the agency was? And what evidence do I have to believe that they really made that change, right? Because in 1975, you had the Church Committee, which exposed some of the most horrible and unbelievable crimes the CIA committed, brainwashing U.S. citizens, attempted assassinations all over the world. And while that led to increased scrutiny from the press in the 70s and 80s, the death squads in Central America kept going. The CIA, U.S. intelligence writ large was part of the reason we invaded Iraq and ended up killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people there. I know that the CIA knows, people in Washington know that the CIA got a bad reputation. So a lot of things that the CIA would have been doing in the 50s and 60s are done by different organizations now. And I don't think that there's, some unknown mass murder operation being carried out. But I also guess that in 25 years, some other journalist is going to write a story about things that were happening in 2020 that we don't know about right now.
Yeah, I suppose one of the most sort of remarkable things for me is, reading the book, you think about what happened recently in Bolivia or in Venezuela, and the sort of the credulity with which these events are met by, the EU said, yeah, we need to get rid of Maduro, and the response to particularly to Bolivia. It does make you think that not much has changed in South America. Vincent, you've been fantastic. We went slightly over an hour. Thank you for joining us. If people want to buy your book, where's the best place to buy it?
Well, you can get it anywhere. So in the UK, it's anywhere you want to get it. I think Hive will get it through your local independent store, hive.co.uk, if you want to avoid the big companies. But it'll be in every bookstore in a couple of days because they're restocking the second printing. So yeah, anywhere that you want to support a bookseller, and hopefully my book as well. The
first run, it's sold out. Is that correct?
In some outlets, it's sold out.
That's great.
It doesn't. You don't have to sell a lot of books. All that means is that we sold a little more than they expected. But yeah, it'll say that it's on sale in a lot of outlets, but they're not going to get their second copies until I think Thursday, in 2 days from now.
Okay. Well, best of luck, Vincent. Thank you very much. It's a great book. Everybody watching, I think, should give it a read. Michael Walker will be back with Tiski Sauer tomorrow evening, and I'll be back with him on Friday night. My name's Aaron Bastani. This was the Bastani Factor from Novara Media. I'll see you again on Friday. Good night.